Cate Hall, a real pleasure to be interviewing you here today. Fantastic. Thank you for joining our kind of Focal Data podcast. It's an absolute privilege to be able to interview the Queen of Agency. But I guess before you can take that title, I think our listeners would love to know a little more about your background, or if they're just coming in cold. Love to know a little bit about your story, a little bit about why agency is super important, and follow-up question to that, why do we use the word agency? Is that a problem?
So, my name is Cate Hall. I'm currently CEO of Astera Institute, which is a large private foundation that sponsors emerging technology. When I think about my background and the connection to agency, I often sort of bucket thing bucket things in two buckets. So there's like the impressive things that I have done, which is I was a Supreme Court litigator. I was the top ranked female poker player in the world. I now run one of the world's largest foundations. And so I've had success sort of switching from career to career a few different times. And that's sort of part of my agency credentials. On the flip side, there's the stuff that I've really messed up in life, which is that I was a drug addict for several years. I had a couple of different periods of substance abuse, but I spent 3 years in my mid 30s at sort of the absolute bottom in terms of agency, where I was really, really stuck in one particular way of living and had very little freedom to escape that. And so my personal story is sort of like one of rising and then falling and then rising again agency. And I think that gives me some unique perspective on the topic.
Is you just describing the kind of waves of agency or lack of it? I think what you're describing is very non-linear in the sense that you rose to the top of several slightly unrelated fields, which is, I think, what a lot of people have as markers of high agency. That people tend to be able to do that, but then losing it. So it's almost like A, it's not inherent, but B, you have the capacity to lose or increase it at any point in time. What are your reflections on why you had it in the first place? What were the other markers? What were the other signals of being the best poker player in the world and being a kind of Supreme Court advocate? And then what do you think the tipping point was to just losing it, that kind of reverse agency process?
Yeah, I think so. I will start by saying I definitely do not think that agency is an inherent thing. I think that it is a trait that people vary on over the course of their lives. I think one of the mistakes that people often make in agency discourse is treating it as though it is a thing that is fixed rather than something that is malleable. I actually think that I started my life and through the age of almost 30 was actually really low on agency. So I was a very successful person. I did a bunch of, high achieving things in undergrad, and then I went to the best law school, and then I got like the best job. And so I was very successful on this narrow track that I was on, but I also had these massive blind spots where I was not really thinking critically at all about why I was doing the things that I was doing. Like, why did I care about law to the extent that I did? And I kind of got to around the age of 30 and was like, oh, I don't actually want to be living the life that I'm living. I don't want the life of anybody who I see around me. So let's try to do something totally different. For me, a lot of the impetus there was getting acquainted with LSD, which is a great it's one of the highest leverage things I think for bursting whatever bubble you happen to be in. Also has some downsides, but that was a huge lever for me. And so I think switching from law to poker and just being like, I don't enjoy what I'm doing. I'm going to take a leap. I'm going to go somewhere else and I'm going to figure it out. I didn't really aspire to be incredible at poker at the time that I switched over. It was just like, this is something that I really enjoy, and I'm going to do that for myself. I'm going to do something that I enjoy for a while. And that leap was really kind of like the first high agency thing that I think that I did. And then the loss of agency is just like the same loss of agency that occurs in any drug addiction, which is, you have some reason why you get started using drugs. And often it's like fun. For me, it was like highly spiritually connected. So it had kind of an origin that I think was actually like good in many ways, but it became this like compulsive tendency over time, as it often does. And so it wasn't as though there were like one tipping point where I suddenly stopped being agentic, but it was this gradual decline where over the course of several years, my behavior became more and more automatic, less and less reflective, less and less free. And I got to a point when I was about 37 where I was just like not able to do anything basically except for use drugs. And that was my whole life.
And if we think about that moment of reframing, of you kind of taking back control, which for British listeners will be a very familiar slogan. What do you think? Did it come in a single clear moment, crystalline moment, or was it a slow process?
I kind of joke about this sometimes because I think that there tends to be this lay impression of addiction recovery as, you hit rock bottom and then you realize what your problem is, and that just straight out from there. And my experience has been that there are just dozens or hundreds of bottoms over the course of addiction. Like you just keep ending up at lower and lower points where you're like, surely this is enough to get me to recover. And it's not until at some point it is. And I think that definitely the turning point for me was the point at which I decided, okay, I will give up and go to a residential treatment center for 30 days, which turned into 60 days. I think without that, I would quite possibly still be in bad shape. But there wasn't like a particular moment that caused me to be open to that. It was more just grace is how I think about it. I think this is a part of why people who go through 12-step recovery are so focused on higher power. It's like, why do you get it one day when you haven't every other day? After I'd spent like 2 years trying to recover by that point and still hadn't been willing to take that final step. And it's kind of a mystery.
I mean, I guess just to kind of dwell on that, on the concept of grace and the original 12 steps, how do you think in a kind of, for many people, post-religious world, but not for all, how can people find that kind of language and framing and just a sense that it's not all down to them? Slightly paradoxical, isn't it? You can find your own path by acknowledging something else. Like what are the toolkits to do that? What are the frames that can be used?
Yeah, I do think it's kind of paradoxical. And so the idea of surrender is really bizarre to me because I know from personal experience and the experience of others that surrender works in the sense of, turning over what happens in some relevant way to your higher power, to God, to your community, and recognizing that you don't have the ability to control everything. It is very weird that works to help you actually concretely regain some sort of control over your life and your sanity in some way, when it is fundamentally about giving control over to something that you don't understand. And I have just sort of accepted that surrender is one of the mysterious, mystical concepts in the universe that I don't have a particularly compelling explanation for, but it does seem to be really central to 12-step recovery. And I think that people find lots of ways of doing that without the real religious element of that. There's all sorts of workarounds where you don't actually have to believe in God, you don't have to believe in a higher power per se. I think for me, that part wasn't so hard because I happen to believe in God. I'm one of the few weirdos in SF tech that does. But that certainly made 12-step recovery that much easier for me.
And it's super, super interesting just to hear and quite moving. And I think our listeners will be wondering, did you notice any traits or any corners of culture where it's easier to be agentic versus not? Like, what is the degree to which you think it's almost infectious or kind of socially driven? Like, are there cultures of agency? I mean, and to that, not to lead the witness, obviously you're based out there on the West Coast, and obviously a lot of this discussion has been rooted from there. Yeah, it'd be great for you to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. I think the relationship that the Bay Area and the tech community has to agency is really interesting. So it seems to sort of be growing out of this area as a discussion topic. And certainly people who are like in startup culture in the tech scene are very interested in agency as a group. Um, I think that I actually have like a little bit of an ambivalence to how the culture here relates to agency, because I think that it agency is most usefully applied as like a personal development vector when you're talking about people who are really kind of like stuck in lives that they don't totally want, but they don't understand why that is. And they want to kind of start finding degrees of freedom that they don't realize that they have. The 20-year-old YC founder who dropped out of Stanford to do whatever, and lives in a group house and, has the life of a young person in tech here is probably not the person who needs to increase their agency, honestly. Like, they are there. And I think that the sort of like dark side of agency is that it can kind of be used also to justify some antisocial traits. And so the title of my book, which I have coming out next year, is You Can Just Do Things. And that's become kind of a rallying cry in Silicon Valley for agency. And I have a complicated relationship with that phrase itself, because often you will hear people do sort of antisocial, narcissistic things and then say, you can just do things. And it's like, that's not exactly what I think we have in mind by agency.
Yeah, I mean, all things are a spectrum. And I guess that there's a version of having so much agency that you don't think about impact, what it's going to do necessarily on other people. I guess from I think just kind of dovetailing a little bit into the technology side and the fact that this is a word like that's come out of, I guess, the build out of agentic technology. That's led to, I guess, the carryover of both the word and the concepts into understanding how it's going to reframe people. Are there any cultures that you think are really just agentic naturally, where you've come across, where clearly you've studied it across multiple domains and different areas? Are there kind of unexpected corners of high agency where you thought that's extremely non-obvious and interesting?
It's a really great question. So I have found actually, so one example I think is probably the effective altruism community here, which is another example of sort of a double-edged sword. So a lot of the exposure that I got to highly agentic people came from my exposure to the effective altruism movement. Even as I had like some background that evidenced high agency, but I really got sort of supercharged in my capacity by exposure to a few individuals, some of whom I co-founded the company with. And the attitude of those people was, there's a pandemic happening right now. We don't see anybody making shelf-stable vaccines that are going to be usable in low-income countries. Why don't we do that? So we just went out and did it without a lot of background, and then set sort of insane deadlines for ourselves. We submitted our clinical trial application 3 months after the company's founding. And those types of goals and objectives are things that I would have never set on my own because they seemed so unreasonable. But there is this kind of urgency and refusal to deal with the world as it is that I think arises in some people who are really concerned about big picture risks in the world that I admire. And I've sort of like absorbed some of that even as I'm no longer a part of that particular community. So that might be a good example. That's also kind of like a tech adjacent community. I think that the classic startup mentality of figure out what you're annoyed by in the world and then build a company around addressing that annoyance is sort of an inherently agentic way of approaching the world. And so to that extent, just the general startup tech community here also has a lot to say about the subject.
And in terms of trying to roll out high agency behaviors, and you talk about acting with more degrees of freedom, when you're talking to various companies and various people and you're thinking, how can we roll out this kind of playbook for humanity? What's your starting point? Let's say you kind of walk into an organization and you're thinking, what's my toolkit for increasing agency here? Like, how do you do it at the organizational level? And then how do you do it at the big question coming? How do you do that at the societal level? Like clearly a lot of this is very downstream of big aspects of American culture. Like, what does it mean for Europe to become a more high agency culture? There's a lot there.
Yeah. And I'm going to level with you. I don't have a great answer when it comes to the societal level. I've thought about this a lot at the individual level and have increasingly been thinking about it at the organizational level. I thought that the piece that you released recently was really excellent and very interesting in connecting a lot of problems that we see in politics and the world today to loss of agency. And that's something that I'm really interested to explore going forward. The biggest sort of level of organization at which I've thought about it a lot is sort of the individual, maybe smallish ecosystem or large organization level. I think that's a lot of what I do in my job now at Astera is try to recruit talented people who are working on projects that they're passionate about that are in service of some lofty goal for humanity and teach them how to raise their ambition, raise their agency such that they're able to be more effective advocates for and like engineers of the future that they want to see.
And what are your hacks for hiring agentic people? We've all grown, but we're desperate to hear yours.
For hiring agentic people?
Yeah, what you're spotting is a latent, something that's latent, even if it can be improved.
Okay, so this is not at all useful. This is not at all useful. I feel like, and I think this is actually common among a lot of people who think that slash are good at spotting talent, is I just have kind of a sixth sense for it. And I can almost tell, like, in the first 5 minutes that I'm talking to somebody, whether they're fully switched on mentally and really like thinking laterally. The actual answer is that I rely on almost nothing in hiring except for that gut instinct that I get, plus really extensive background interviews of people, like talking to all of the people who they've worked with in the past, getting a sense for how they view that person. I'm really a big zealot for making sure that I talk to people who have not enjoyed working with a person before, in order to figure out like why that is. And a lot of times, like if it's somebody who has had conflict at work because they've been too demanding, they've been not sufficiently respectful of organizational structure, they're like irritating and that they're always asking for things, that's like a pretty good sign that it's an agentic person to me. And then there's some degree of just like, what has this person done in their life that doesn't show up on their resume that they are excited about? And it's not like just directly aimed at getting things from the world, but it's more a pure expression of how they respond to being highly activated by something in the world.
And that's how you pick them out. Let's say they're then at your organization or the organization that you're advising. What are the things that kind of managers should be doing to grow someone's sense of agency? Because that appears to be the much more important turnkey for organizations, necessarily picking people out, because you might be an organization of 50 people, 500 people. If you can make them all 10% more agentic, that has huge outsized gains.
Yeah, I think that just there's a couple categories of things. So one I would say is the category of communication and learning to make a lot more explicit that isn't usually explicit, especially in work cultures. There's actually like a Silicon Valley, the TV show clip that I like, where one of the characters, Gavin, is putting honey into his tea or something, and he says, "The bear is sticky with honey." And then his subordinates spend like the rest of the episode trying to figure out what he meant by the bear is sticky with honey and like what this implies about his strategy when he was just like literally talking about the little honey bear being sticky with honey. I think that like a lot of workplace communication defaults into this where people are constantly trying to guess what other people mean instead of just being super direct about it. And as the leader of an organization, you can do a lot to normalize direct communication, honest, respectful, but honest feedback. Saying things like, I don't know, or I was wrong about that. There's like a whole level of realness that you can bring to the way that people communicate with each other that doesn't usually exist. And I think that level, that like bandwidth of communication is really important for increasing agency. So we're not all just like walking around in this sort of dream logic where we're not allowed to talk about the things that really matter. And then there's like also a general category of trying to get people to question their constraints. So we have a lot of people coming from academia who come here to be residents where, you know, we will pay for them to spend a year here. We'll pay for a team for them, a lab, whatever they want. And a lot of those people are coming from an academic background where they've gotten very used to pleading for a particular grant amount that is set at the beginning of a year that is allowed to be spent in very circumscribed ways. And they've become very good through operating in that system to the point where they're able to become professors or otherwise like well respected. They've gotten very good at operating within constraints. So like sort of contorting themselves into whatever shape they need to in order to be able to survive in this academic system. And a lot of what we do with people, especially in the like first 6 months they're here, is just continuously asking them, like, is that actually a constraint? You know, can you do this thing 10 times faster if we give you 10 times as much money to do it? It's always a good question to ask. Like, can you just hire more? Can you get rid of, or can you go around this regulatory hurdle? There's a lot of stuff that we encourage people to do in-house that we wouldn't necessarily do at an ordinary foundation. It's like we innovate quite a bit with financial instruments and new methods of funding. And we're constantly trying to like figure out, is there a better way for us to do this? Is it possible for us to do it ourselves? And it's sort of like trying to transmit that mindset of you don't have to accept the constraints that you see when you look around. You can just ask for things to be a different way, seek to make them a different way. It's like a subtle shift when you describe it, but I think it's actually a pretty radical change in mindset when it is operationalized.
Where do you think, what are the kind of organizational structures that can basically give people the confidence to realize there are very little constraints there? Again, a lot of European users will not come from cultures where constraints are necessary things to be encouraged, to be got out of. And it's a bit meta, but like, how do you think we've got here? Like, why do you think it is at a societal level you think that agency has declined, or has it at all?
I'm sure that it has. Yeah, so I don't have like a lot to say about the European experience. I think though that I see similar things to what you're describing in the American experience as well, which is just like in most places in America, maybe not in my immediate community, but a sense of loss of agency, loss of control over the direction of one's life because it is so shaped by factors beyond one's control. And I'm tempted to like attribute this to bureaucracy and sort of like the labyrinthine systems through which people are forced to operate their lives. But I don't have a great diagnosis for it. And I'm a little bit interested to hear what your take on this is, because I think that you spent orders of magnitude more time thinking about this manifestation of agency than I have.
Yeah, I mean, just for listeners, I think Kay and I come to the agency question from two ends of the telescope. I think you're looking at it very much from the personal perspective, the individual story, the kind of transformational aspect of both of organizations. I've been thinking about it very much in terms of politics and systems and countries, like, and how we've got here. My view is we broadly ended up here for a couple of things. The first thing that leads to loss of agency, at least on the polling we've done here at Focaldata, is if certain background characteristics you have lead to too many anchors in your life that make it much harder to act with degree. Sometimes it's hard to act with degrees of freedom because you don't actually have those degrees of freedom. So, fundamentally, the slower growth, I think, across the Western world has been very damaging for agency. People who are agentic are much less likely to have certain kind of barriers, educational or their familial setup or what have you, right? They tend to be factors that clearly affect your propensity. The second, I think, that's more interesting, that's less to do with kind of economics or raw kind of socioeconomic background, I think, is to do with the rise of legalism and systems, which is around the construction of very, very large organizations with rules with no accountability, feedback, and no feedback loop between performance and basically incentives. And I think that's been a mixture of potentially an equalization in incentives between people who do badly and people who do well. And complicated systems potentially happen because there is just a natural gravitation towards creating complexity. And lack of accountability. And you have to actively remove things as a conscious thing. And basically, over the last 30, 40 years, it's become harder to basically know what you should even be doing in order to do a good job across
it really resonates, especially the point about like decoupling accountability and incentives. I think the most frustrating thing of dealing with large bureaucracies, whether they're governmental or non-governmental, is that feeling of there is actually nobody whose responsibility it is to solve a problem. The responsibility for it is sort of distributed across a wide variety of people, and nobody feels like they own a problem ever. This is why it is so much more satisfying in my experience to work at startups where there is a small team that by necessity takes ownership for things. But that feeling of distributed control or authority is really toxic. And it's one of the places where this comes up in the US so much is the healthcare system, where it's like, I have things that I've just actually given up on getting healthcare for, because it's just like, it's nobody's responsibility to make sure that my insurance will approve this procedure that I need. I could spend hours and hours and hours on the phone with different people and nobody would ever solve the problem. So like, I guess I just won't have the procedure, And I think that the healthcare system is kind of like an extreme example of this larger tendency where responsibility is so distributed that actually it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for people in the tech world, the term DRI, directly responsible individual, is often used for reversing that process. So I guess if we're to move from that kind of point you just made on distributed responsibility, which some people call as pressure, some people call it accountability, some people call it just your personal work. Why do you think that's happened? I mean, we talked about the natural growth of bureaucracies and the natural growth of but it does seem to me a cultural thing. I had a friend who, and I don't, you're going to have to correct me whether this is actually the case, given that you actually live in the States. He described seeing lifts, elevators, basically how on the sides of elevators would be personally signed copies of basically guaranteeing the safety of that lift from someone. Someone in America is responsible, some commissioner or someone from some kind of health and safety organization, and there is someone's name on the lift, so that if the lift doesn't work, there is direct traceability to that person. And this friend was describing moving from Europe to the States and saying that just wouldn't happen here in the UK, because if the lift doesn't work, is it the building contractor? Is it the lift manufacturer? And a lot of our society is basically about apportionment of both the blame, but of lack of accountability. And he just described the glory of taking in America and just knowing that there was someone there who didn't just care, but who was on the hook. Someone could be fired, someone could be promoted. Think
Hmm.
skin in the game, I guess, in kind of Nicholas Taleb and all that kind of stuff. Is your what are the other what's your other versions of names on the elevator that you can think of in culture?
So it's interesting because as you're saying this, I'm like, wow, that is such an unusual situation, actually. Like I know that this happens. There are elevator inspectors. I would imagine that it happens anytime you have inspections, like food safety inspections and stuff too. But actually, that feeling of having somebody who is responsible for the thing is so rare, and that feels like it is so much of the problem that it doesn't happen in a lot of other places. Like, yeah, even other sort of domains that you would think would be analogous, like how different is it to have your utilities set up or fixed as compared to an elevator that is working? Like classic example of if you're not like on the right list for the right utility, you can just go months here without getting things set up. And so there, I don't think that that is like an American thing. I think that might just be an elevator thing, unfortunately. I am really interested in this question though, of like how much has this changed over time? Because I have the impression that it has changed a lot, but I'm also one person with one life. And so it's always really difficult to disentangle our personal impressions from what is actually happening at a larger level. Um, and I feel like having the experience of being a pollster must be really interesting because you actually get objective information on some of these questions, like how are these things changing over time? And I'm curious, like how that has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. I'm not sure that you've been a pollster for that long, but you might have an opinion on it
I sound
nonetheless.
good enough. So I
Okay.
thanks for not making an assumption. So from my perspective, the listeners might be very interested that there's a world something called the World Values Survey that is conducted by King's College London, a school, kind of top school here. And within that survey is contained a series of questions that basically do pertain to agency. And in our study, we replicated one of them, and that's basically the question of whether you feel that you are in control of your life. And in other words, does where you are broadly align with what you think you've done? Or do you think you have control over where you end up? And there's a couple of really interesting things. First of all, it's definitely decreased because there's a massive generational cohort effect. And what we can see is that basically newer cohorts of people feel they have less agency, and older people feel that they do, but that's not necessarily related to people increasing the amount of agency as they get older. So yeah, younger folks definitely feel that they have less agency. And if you roll that forward, and a society that is entirely non-agentic, both in terms of form, in terms of the society, in terms of organizations, yeah, I think we're in for big trouble. I guess my question to you, you're CEO of a foundation. Like, what are the productivity gains of agentic people? Like, look, are we talking like 2x, 3x, 10x? Because my instinct is that it is very, very large. Like one agentic person can totally change the outcomes, possible
Yeah.
universal outcomes, which is why I'm very interested in how you make non-agentic people agentic.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I also have the sense that it's a really large difference potentially. Multiples are always tricky, but like I think there's probably just a range of outcomes that are really important at a social level that are simply not achievable unless you have agentic people leading the charge. Um, I believe that that applies to a lot of the projects that we support here. So we're supporting things like terraforming efforts for other planets, geoengineering for Earth, various types of emerging energy technologies and AI things. And I think that there are a lot of things whenever you're sort of like operating at the frontier of a technology or a system, you are going to encounter a lot of resistance from the world about what you are wanting to do. There are always no shortage of people excited to tell you why what you want to do is impossible or stupid. And the capacity to push beyond that and to deal with difficult technological challenges as well as like social and practical challenges. I actually just I don't think it's so much a matter of speeding things up or getting higher ROI. I think that there's a bunch of things that just cannot be accomplished without highly agentic people leading the effort. And so from a social ROI perspective, it seems really, really high. And it seems sort of critical for making sure that the future goes well. We have an incredible technological transition coming up one way or another. And I think that the world will look very different in 10 to 20 years, depending on basically the efforts of a relatively small number of people who are trying to figure out how to make that go well.
Yeah, I mean, that's really useful. And I think, look, I think we're heading towards the quick fire rounds now. Listeners will be really interested to understand your kind of immediate reactions to kind of agency and agentic behavior. So could you give me, Cate, two examples, one from someone public who everyone will know and someone from someone only you will know, of highly agentic behaviors that you think are just like they should be role modeled?
Oh, okay. So different questions, like whether I think they should be role models and whether they're highly agentic. I think Elon is the classic case of a highly agentic person that everybody can relate to, just because he's managed to sort of move the needle in a large number of different domains that he was a complete outsider to. And regardless of how you feel about him, there is that. Like, he is an extremely agentic person. A good example of somebody from my own life, I think, is my friend Nan Ranselhoff, who runs Frontier Climate. So Nan read the 2018 IPCC report, realized that we needed a lot more carbon removal, and set about trying to make a market for carbon removal. And she has, in the last few years, basically recruited $1 billion of capital into carbon removal technologies. And yeah, I'm totally blown away by her.
Phenomenal, and a very interesting pairing for our listeners. If someone just had 1 minute to themselves every day to think about how they might be more agentic, what would be the two questions they would ask themselves?
There's a whole category of things that I think about as like abyss staring, after this guy Ben Kuhn that I really like. But there's a whole category of questions that are just like trying to find the questions that cut you the deepest, that make you question most what you're doing in your life. And that's like, if nobody else could see what I'm doing, what I still want to be doing, what I'm doing, am I in the right job or partnership, or are these things harmful? So there's like abyss staring questions, and then there's like a very simple, hacky question that I use all the time for everything, which is just, is there a better way to do this? And I think if you can train yourself to ask yourself that question consistently throughout the day, you can have huge gains in terms of agency and productivity and what you want in life, from just that like one cool trick.
Brilliant. And I think before we kind of finish off, what do you think, and feel free to take as short or as long as you want in relation to this answer, if you were advising people training the next generation, either of kids, nurturing them as they grow up, or in fact junior employees, what is the story that can be the turnkey to get people to believe that being agentic is important? Because I mean, we're both convinced by it, right? So this is slightly the zealot and the convert having a conversation. I'm interested in understanding the people who may be more skeptical, don't really understand agency. What have you done to really focus the mind and create that kind of mini moment where someone can really understand why it is important? Because it is really important, and it seems no one does care. So clearly the comms around agency haven't worked.
Yes, I would say that this is a large part of what I'm attempting to do with my book, which is like, it's meant to be, in addition to a very practical guide to how to increase agency, the story of how I went from being a very successful person who had very low agency and sort of didn't understand the concept, to the person that I am today, which is like also successful, but much more relevantly like reflective, excited about the things that I'm doing. I have a life that aligns with what I want it to, and feel like I have the ability to influence the world in the way that I care about. And I feel like that yeah, that sort of like shift in this is really important to think about. It's really high leverage and it's also very, very susceptible to change is what I am trying to transmit to people in general.
And I'd highly recommend to everyone listening to this podcast, Cate Hall's book on You Can Just Do Things. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Will be out soon and will be, I think, potentially one of the most influential books out of the year. So yeah, we're looking forward to it. And I guess, Kate, before we wrap up, any questions the other way?
No questions in particular. I'm really excited to talk to you more in general about the different ways that we approach this question because it does feel like we're coming from two totally different points of view where I'm building up from the individual level and you're like breaking down from the social level and the interaction is just so interesting to explore to me. So I'm glad that we happened to cross each other.
Brilliant. Well, Kate, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.